Hello, BookTube. Today I'd like to talk about the Brothers Grimm. Now, we all know the Brothers Grimm. We all know the most famous stories from the Brothers Grimm, but how many people have read the complete collection from cover to cover? Well, I have, so you don't have to, because I'd like to talk today about my experience of reading the complete, unabridged Brothers Grimm. So, first of all, let me talk briefly about why I wanted to do this. I had a collection of the Brothers Grimm as a kid. It was not the complete unabridged version, it was selected stories. I think most versions you buy in bookstores are actually selected stories, although let me know what your experience is. What's being sold at your local bookstore? As a kid, I didn't appreciate that the Brothers Grimm were real historical people. I thought, it was like Mother Goose. It was just the name of what the fairy tales were called. But then, of course, as I got older, I learned that these were real historical people, and that increased my interest in this collection of stories as a body of work. I think most of us have a similar experience, right? I don't know. Let me know what your experience is, but I suspect most of us don't realize the Brothers Grimm are real people until we get a little bit older. But yeah, the Brothers Grimm are interesting. I started to get interested in them more when they started popping up in my reading material. For example, The Revolutions of 1848 by Priscilla Robertson, which I've talked about on this YouTube channel. Jacob Grimm was one of the politicians involved in it. I don't remember exactly what his role was. I think he was one of the liberal part of the liberal new constitution and one of the German states in 1848. But he was a prominent politician in his day. He was also a prominent linguist. And since I've moved on to studying linguistics, he's popped up in a few of the books I've read about linguistics. For example, this one, which I reviewed earlier this war, The Linguistic Wars, talks briefly, very briefly, but briefly, about the work they did trying to uncover the roots of the Indo-European languages. So the Brothers Grimm, Jacob Grimm especially, was interested in historical linguistics, trying to figure out how sounds have changed over time, what were the rules for how sounds have changed over time, and trying to trace back the modern European languages to their ancient roots, the original Indo-European language. So this book and a couple other books reference the work of the Brothers Grimm on historical linguistics, or Jacob Grimm in particular. I saw a YouTube video, and I didn't save the link, unfortunately, so I can't point you to it. But somebody was saying that Jacob Grimm was like the Noam Chomsky of his day. I don't think he was nearly as radical as Noam Chomsky, but he was somebody who was very influential in linguistics, and he was somebody who was very influential in politics. And his contemporaries regarded him as a genius in both fields. So, in that respect, perhaps similar to Noam Chomsky. Anyways, interested in the Brothers Grimm maybe as people and in their historical legacy, I've been interested in tracking this down for some time. I've been living abroad for the past 20 years, which has made it a little bit difficult to get access to books. For example, when I was living in Cambodia, I picked up a copy of the Brothers Grimm at an English bookstore there, and then got it back home and realized it was only selected stories. And I'm like, no. I want to do the complete version. So I found this in a bookstore here in Saigon. This is the complete Brothers Grimm, all 200 stories and 10 legends. So it's essentially 210 stories, counting the legends. Now, I guess I should talk a little bit about what is the complete Brothers Grimm. It turns out, if you dig into this a little bit, They actually published 7 versions of their stories, their fairy tales. Although, fairy tales. I should note, fairy tales is not what they called it. They called it children's and household tales. And in fact, many of the stories in here actually don't really conform to what we would think of as fairy tales. There's actually no fairies in these stories, oddly enough. They're more folk tales, I think might be a better way to describe them. But everybody knows them now as Brothers Grimm's fairy tales, so no use changing the name now. We'll go with that. Anyways, they published 7 versions of these over the years. They kept revising it. They would rewrite some of these stories, make them a little bit more literary. Over the years, they would add more and more stories in, so the 7th edition is the most complete edition. But they also took stories out over the years, stories that did not meet their agenda for one reason or another. So I think what is commonly regarded as the complete Brothers Grimm is their 7th edition, because that's the largest edition. And these has the stories in their final form as the Brothers Grimm wanted them to be remembered. However, there are about 30 stories which were in previous editions which got taken out. And those were not in this edition. Although I did a little bit of searching around on Amazon just out of curiosity, because I was like, I wonder if somebody's put together a volume that includes all of the stories from the 7th edition, plus those 30 stories that got taken out over the years for like a ultimate complete Brothers Grimm. And I searched around on Amazon, and sure enough, that edition does exist out there if you really want the complete. I just read the 7th edition without the omitted stories, but I'm still going to call this as complete. Certainly it's as complete, I think, as I'm likely to find out here in Vietnam. Right. So, the story behind how this evolved is interesting, and I don't want to. I'll talk a little bit about it because I think it is interesting, and I have done some digging around on the internet while I was researching this. I'm not an expert. I'm just a guy with an internet connection. A lot of this comes from YouTube, Wikipedia, stuff like that. But the Brothers Grimm, as you are probably familiar, portrayed themselves as sort of archivists. They went out into the villages. They collected all the stories. They wanted to preserve these stories for posterity, so they wrote them down, and then they just archived them all in this volume. One of the YouTube videos I watched on this, and again, I've lost the link to this, sorry, but there was a lecturer saying that when this was first released, it confused the public, because they were like, what am I supposed to do with this? Is this a work of scholarship, or is this something for entertainment? And it was called Children's and Household Tales, but apparently even at the time there was some debate about whether it was really intended for children, because some of the darker turn of some of the stories, and because it seemed like the original intent maybe was to preserve the scholarship. That scholarship aspect of it was further highlighted by the fact that Jacob Grimm included notes for each story. Like he said, okay, I got this story from a peasant who lived in the area of Hesse. There was an alternate version in the same town which went like this, and he detailed all those notes. Those notes are not in this edition. They are available online. At least half of them seem to be available on Wiki Commons, Wikisource, and probably elsewhere. everything's on the internet these days. Yeah, so that's maybe another way where I can't say I've read the complete version because I've not read Jacob Grimm's notes, but Jacob Grimm's notes were included in the original version, and have been translated into English, I think, but not in this version. So yeah, it appeared to be a work of scholarship with a lot of notes. Now, what's interesting, if you dig further into this, is that the Brothers Grimm lied in some of their notes. They actually got a lot of these stories from the library, not from the peasants directly. And many of the stories came from one of their neighbors, who was a middle-class woman. So they presented these stories as kind of, from the mouths of the peasants. And some of them, I think, came from the peasants. Apparently, they did send their graduate students out. But the bulk of them, or a lot of them, did not. And apparently, they fudged the details in their notes to hide the scholarship. There's an interesting discussion on this in the BBC radio series In Our Time, where the presenter Melvin Bragg takes the view that they fudged the books and scholars should never fudge the books, and so we can't forgive that. But his two guests argue against it, and they say, well, there's an interplay between written accounts and oral accounts. And so even if the Brothers Grimm did get the story out of the library, it's kind of okay for them to say that they actually got it from a peasant, even though they really didn't, because that illustrates the interplay of how these stories develop. Ultimately, that's just kind of a historical footnote, but it is interesting. The other thing that's interesting is that they took stories out over the years. Again, as I mentioned before, there are 30 stories that didn't make it into this final edition. And apparently the reason for this is because they wanted to show that they had an agenda. That it was sort of a nationalistic, romantic agenda for German nationalism. And stories apparently that did not fit that agenda for one reason or another were taken out. I think the most famous ones that I saw on the Wikipedia's list were Puss in Boots and The Princess and the Pea. Both of those stories are famous for other reasons. I mean, we obviously still know them today. A lot of these stories are famous even without the Brothers Grimm. For example, Cinderella has a long history even before the Brothers Grimm got it. I'm not sure why Puss in Boots and The Princess and the Pea were taken out. There are other stories apparently that the reason for taking them out was obvious. They were too violent or something like that. Or something like that. So stories were taken out. The other thing is that these stories were revised over time in a couple of different ways. Apparently, Wilhelm Grimm made them more literary over time, adding more literary flourishes. For example, here is the beginning to story number 1, The Frog King or Iron Henry. It says, in old times, when wishing still helped one, there lived a king whose daughters were all beautiful. But the youngest was so beautiful that the sun itself, which had seen so much, was astonished whenever it shone in her face. Close by the king's castle lay a great dark forest, and under an old lime tree in the forest was a well, etc. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but that apparently is a later literary flourish that was added by Wilhelm Grimm. In addition, they also changed some of these stories around to meet their themes. Apparently, the big changes are in the original versions of these stories. There was a lot of wicked mothers. Like, for example, in Snow White, it was not a stepmother, it was actually her mother. In Hansel and Gretel, it was actually her mother, their mother. And over time, they decided that they didn't like this negative reflection of German mothers. So they changed them all to stepmothers. Some sexual innuendos apparently got taken out or toned down. Interestingly enough, though, apparently the violence did not get toned down, and in fact, the violence increased in later volumes. Now, it's not graphically violent. Nothing here is told in enough detail to really be graphic. But it is noticeable when you're reading through this that every story seems to end with someone getting killed at the very end. So, the Wicked Queen was taken out and killed, or she was put into a barrel full of nails and thrown into the river, and then everyone was happy. And apparently that aspect of it was magnified more over the years. I've got that little bit from two different sources. That's both from the In Our Time radio show and from Wikipedia. So, yeah, I guess that's the background. Let's talk about the reading experience. So, everybody knows the Brothers Grimm, but the really famous Brothers Grimm stories are maybe less than you might think. By my count, there are 11 uber famous Brothers Grimm stories that everyone knows. There's The Frog Prince, Hansel and Gretel, Snow White, Cinderella, Little Red Riding Hood, Rumpelstiltskin, Rapunzel. Sorry, I've lost track of which ones I've already mentioned. That's the danger of doing these videos without notes, huh? 11. The Shoemaker and the Elves. I counted them out before, and I think there's 11 stories which just everybody knows. But that's only 11 out of 210 stories. There are a lot of famous fairy tales which actually don't belong to the Brothers Grimm. For example, Jack and the Beanstalk. That's not actually one of the Brothers Grimm stories. That comes from like an English tradition. Or Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Not the Brothers Grimm. Or all Hans Christian Andersen stories. So a lot of the fairy tales that you maybe associate with the Brothers Grimm don't actually come from the Brothers Grimm. Now, in addition to those 11 uber famous stories, I think there are some stories that are relatively well known, maybe not quite as famous. In that category, I would count maybe The Wolf and the Seven Kids. It's fairly widely told, but I don't think it's nearly as ubiquitous as Cinderella or something. Something like The Bremen Musicians, about the horse, the cat, and the rooster who frightened the robbers. Something like The Magic Porridge Pot, something like that. So these are stories that you may well have encountered as a child reading a collection of folk tales or something like that. They're kind of out there. So by my math, and let me know if you think I'm getting this ratio wrong in the comments or something. But by my math, there are 11 stories that everybody knows. And then in addition to that, maybe another 10, 15, 20 stories that are fairly widely known. So let's call that 30 stories that maybe you already know before you start this volume. That still leaves a good 180 stories that you've never heard before. So there's a lot of reading potential in here. If you get your hands on one of these copies, it's not all stories that you already know already, unless you've studied this stuff before or something. It's also pretty long. So again, 210 stories in total, 845 pages. This was originally published in 2 volumes. Of course, that was 2 volumes, including... when I say this... The seventh edition was published in 2 volumes in the original German. The edition I have here is the Wordsworth Edition. It doesn't actually say this, but I've been researching this on the internet, and it looks like I've got the Margaret Hunt translation from 1884. And the Margaret Hunt translation was published in 2 volumes. Now, that included a long introduction by folklorist Andrew Lang. And based on the Wikipedia version, it looks like that original 1884 edition also included translations of Jacob Grimm's notes. Now, again, the introduction and Jacob Grimm's notes are not in this Wordsworth edition. So it's only 1 volume, not published in 2 volumes, but it is 845 pages. So it took me 6 weeks to work through this once I made a serious effort to get through it. So it is, if you're reading it cover to cover, it does take up some time. And again, the vast majority of these stories were new. And when you're reading this, the new stories are, of course, the most interesting. When you get to Cinderella, you're like, oh, Cinderella, I already know this story. Although it turns out that the Grimm brothers version of Cinderella is completely different than the Disney version. So I guess in that respect, it was still fairly interesting. Some of the Cinderella in particular is so different from the version you've seen. Other stories, Little Red Riding Hood, Hansel and Gretel, those stories are more or less as you would expect them. But yes, Cinderella is a completely different story than the Disney version. I mean, there's still a glass slipper and there's still a ball, but there's no fairy godmother. All the details are different. Okay. So yeah, point being, I guess, it's largely new stories. Now, I have to confess that reading this through cover to cover, I found a little bit of a chore. I had made a commitment that I wanted to read through this all. I had decided that this was the time I was finally going to do this after this had sat on my shelf for several years. But yes, I do think perhaps I did this all wrong. I don't think this is meant to be read in large chunks like you would read a novel, because the stories very quickly lose their charm when you're just trying to plow through them all like I was. I think the way this book is best enjoyed is you buy it, you have it sitting on your shelf permanently. Every now and again, like every couple weeks, you take it open, flip to a random story, and then read that random story and then put it back up. But you don't actually try and plow through all the stories at once. Admittedly, I did that all wrong. So that's why I say I've read the whole thing, so you don't have to, because there's not a lot of enjoyment in actually just going through story after story after story. The other thing, in addition to the stories quickly losing their charm because you're reading so much of them at one point, is these stories are very repetitive. And they're repetitive in the broad sense, in that there are a lot of evil stepmothers, there are a lot of princesses who need to be married, there are a lot of clever tailors. There's a lot of stuff that just pops up over and over again. And you're like, oh, this again. But they're also repetitive in very specific ways. For example, there are several different stories in which a girl's brothers have been turned into birds. And she's got to make some clothes to get them turned back. There are several stories in which a boy and a girl are running and they're being pursued by somebody, and they keep transforming themselves into different things, and it's usually very similar things, like a tree and a rose, or a pond and a duck, and that same thing happens like in 3 different stories. There was one thing which popped up in like, I don't know, like 6 stories or something like that, where the prince just all of a sudden forgot about the princess he was supposed to be marrying. Sometimes it's explained by magic, and sometimes it just says, and then he forgot about her. And he's engaged to be married to somebody else. So the princess he was originally supposed to marry shows up at the party, and she's got these beautiful dresses which she gets out of a nut. And then the person that the prince is marrying instead sees the beautiful dresses and says, "Oh, I love that dress. Can I have it?" And the princess says, "You can have it if I can spend one night with the prince." So they make the deal, and then she goes and she spends one night with the prince, and she says, "Don't you remember me? I'm the princess you rescued. I did all this stuff for you." And the prince just sleeps through the whole night and doesn't hear a thing. And then this process is repeated 2 more times. She's got three nuts with 3 different dresses hidden inside the nuts. And then on the 3rd night, finally, she gets the prince to remember who she is. The first 2 nights, apparently, he's been taking a sleeping potion. So that pops up like 6 times or something like that. I didn't actually take notes on how many times each story was popping up, although I think scholars have, folklorists have gone through and kept tallies of which different story parts pop up in which different Brothers Grimm. So that type of thing is it depends how you want to look at these stories. And this comes back to something I was saying earlier. If you look at this as a work of scholarship, and for the moment, put aside the fact that the Grimm brothers fabricated some of their research, I think there's still some scholarship in here, or a lot of scholarship in here. If you look at this as a work of scholarship, then it makes sense to compile all these different stories from all these different villages, and they all have similar elements in them, because you can imagine the same story got told in one village, and then in the next village over, they told a slightly different version of that same story, and these stories all got changed around, and that's why you have all these different stories with exactly the same ending about the prince forgetting the princess. And if you look at it as a work of scholarship, then I guess that makes sense. On the other hand, if you're just reading through all of these like I was, trying to plow through them all, then it's like, oh, this one again. It gets so repetitive so quickly. I mean, already I think within the first 30 stories, I was realizing that certain story elements were just getting repeated several times, and then that just continues all throughout the whole book. Again, that's another reason not to just sit down and read this cover to cover. What is, I guess, maybe relatively interesting is that these stories get mixed and matched. So you'll have the same plot elements, but they'll pop up in different order in different stories. So the thing about the prince always forgetting the princess, that one is always at the end. But then before that, there are different adventures that pop up, and those different adventures, again, very, very repetitive. There's the same adventures that will pop up in different stories, but they get mixed and matched with different endings. So you're like, oh, okay, I recognize this adventure before from story number 23, and I recognize this ending before from story number 56, but I've not seen them before in this combination. That kind of thing. How are we doing on time? Okay, I'm gonna hit stop and then record the new video on another file, and then maybe I'll edit them together or something. All right, what else to talk about? So as I said, there are 200 stories and 10 legends. Now, you're probably wondering, what is the difference between a story and a legend? I can't figure it out. the legends are on religious themes, but many of the stories are also on religious themes. So it's not a clear distinction to me. There's a lot of Christian motifs in this story. The Virgin Mary pops up as a character. St. Peter pops up as a character. Adam and Eve pop up as characters a few times. So that's the legends at the end are based either on biblical characters or some sort of religious experience. So I guess maybe they're Christian legends. But the thing that makes that distinction not work for me is that many of the 200 stories that came before that also have religious experiences or Christian characters in them. This is a bit of a side note here, but the Christian elements, when they do pop up in the Brothers Grimm, seem to be Catholic to me. A veneration of the Virgin Mary, the saints of the Catholic Church, etc. Which surprised me because Germany was one of the Protestant countries, right? I don't know. Maybe the old stories were more Catholic. I don't know. That maybe the villages were more Catholic. Again, as with all of these questions, if anyone knows the answer, let me know in the comments. Now, the numbering of these stories is a little bit funny. So, for example, take story number... Where was it? Take story number 39, The Elves. Story number 39, The Elves, is actually 3 different stories. There's the first story, the second story here, and the third story. And they're all completely different. I mean, they have... The first one is the story we all know, the Shoemaker and the Elves. But then the other 2 about elves exchanging a baby for a changeling. Completely different stories. So why are they all under the same number here? And especially that confuses me when later on you will have 2 different stories which seem to me to be essentially the same stories, but they're given separate numbers. So it's a little bit confusing to me what gets classified as a separate story and what gets classified as like a variant of a story. And speaking of which, one of the discrepancies in the numbers, which you may see depending on which version you look at or which list you're looking at on the internet, is story 151 has 151A, the 12 idle servants, and then 151B, the 3 sluggards. So laziness is a common theme with both stories, but they are different stories. So for that reason, some people classify it as 211 stories, but 211 stories, counting, of course, the 10 legends, which... do we call them legends or stories? Or the nomenclature gets a little bit confusing here. There are actually more stories than the number 210 would indicate, or perhaps less stories if you take into account the fact that many of these stories are just a repeat of previous stories told in slightly different ways. The stories vary in length. The longer stories tend to be about 10 pages or so, but there are a lot of shorter stories, like story 103, Sweet Porridge, which is just 1 paragraph, not even a full page. And there are a lot of stories like that intermixed with the longer stories. Now, I hate to complain about everything, but one thing I did notice when I was reading through this, when I was trying to just plow my way through, is I found it a little bit annoying to have the short stories intermixed with the longer stories. So you'll be reading along, and you'll get to a stretch where there are like 3 short stories in a row. All of them are like only a paragraph long or something. And you're reading through these, and you're kind of getting into the rhythm of short stories. And then you'll get to a story that's 10 pages, and you're like, oh, I have to readjust my narrative expectations again. Yes, the quality of these stories varies widely. There are some stories, I don't know if it's a translation issue or something like that, but there are some of these smaller stories especially which just don't seem to make any sense. What's a good example of this? They'll just be like 2 people talking, and then the story will be over. And you're like, what was the point of that? There are also, even in some of the longer stories, I don't know what's going on. Some of the longer stories seem to be really poorly told. There will be all these things that will happen without any explanation. Like, the boy was walking around, and then he turned into a bird and flew away. And you're like, what? How did he turn into a bird? And I guess it's kind of implied that whenever anything strange like that happens, God is doing it. A lot of these stories seem to have a religious bent. But God seems to act in rather random ways in these stories. There's a one of the things I've realized when I was reading through these stories is when they're adapted by Disney or something like that, like Sleeping Beauty, the rules for the magic are spelled out very clearly. Like, okay, here are the rules for this curse. This is how it works. This is why I, the Wicked Witch, am doing this curse. This is my motivation. All of that is in the movie version. But in the original Brothers Grimm, it's just like, okay, here's a curse, blah, 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 blah. And then the prince kisses her, and she wakes up from the sleep. And it was never really set up that was the way to break the curse. It was just random stuff that happens. And there is also, in a lot of these stories, information that really should have been at the beginning of the story, which is just casually dropped in at the end of the story. For example, quite often a character will be the mother or the stepmother of another character, but you won't find that out until the end of the story. And not in a way like they're being clever about it or like they're trying to create a mystery. Just you get the sense that they forgot to give you that information. And yeah, I'm not quite sure what's going on here, because apparently Wilhelm Grimm did revise these stories to try and make them more literary. But 210 plus stories is a lot. So maybe he didn't get around to all of them. Maybe he got lazy with some of them. Because some of them are quite well told. Some of them do have a lot of narrative flourishes and descriptions in detail, but a lot of them are really just bare bones stories, where there's all these you keep thinking, okay, there's got to be something missing here. How did the characters get from this location to that location, or what is this character doing here all of a sudden? It reminds me a little bit. What's the name of that comic book? I think there was something that was popular a few years ago. I think it was called Dinosaur Cop or something like that, which is somebody wrote down his 5-year-old brother's stories and made them into a comic book. You know what I'm talking about? It was popular on the internet about 10 years ago or so. And what would happen in these stories, because they were told by a 5-year-old, is, a policeman would just all of a sudden turn into a dinosaur, and then you would kind of forget about the dinosaur and you'd go focus on something else next. and there was just such random leaps of logic and changes of focus because it was told by a 5-year-old. That describes many of the stories in here. And again, this is one of the disadvantages of reading them all straight through, is you progressively begin to lose your patience with this. The first story that is just very poorly told and has lots of leaps of logic, you're like, oh, okay, that was something. But by the time you're like 400 pages in, you're like, oh, geez, will you learn how to tell a story? This doesn't make any sense at all. So again, that's another reason why you might not want to read these all straight through. That being said, I've been complaining a lot about these. When it's good, it's really, really good. There are, I don't know, maybe 50 stories in here that were new to me, that I had not heard before. So, not the famous ones, stories that were new to me. And I read them, and I really enjoyed them. And I thought, oh, that is so clever or charming or funny or imaginative. There are some of them where there are all these imaginative lands, or there's there was one where there's this lake underground and all this forest underground. And sorry, I'm not doing a good job of describing this, but there are 50 stories which I found really charming or imaginative. That I didn't actually keep a tally as I was reading. That number is somewhat out of my hat, as they say. But there are some really good stories in here. I'm reminded of something again, which I saw in a YouTube video that I did not keep the link for, where somebody was saying, when this first hit the shelves, people did not know what to do with it. They were confused if it was a work of scholarship or what. It began to get really popular for two reasons. One is that they eventually got around to illustrating it. And once it has illustrations, then it became a lot more popular. The version I have here has illustrations, and a lot of these stories are really dry without the illustrations, but with the illustrations, it does increase the charm of it. But the other thing that apparently made these stories popular in their own day was eventually a selected edition hit the markets, where it says, okay, this isn't all the stories. These are like the best stories. And apparently that version sold really well within the Brothers Grimm's own day. So I was thinking, if I could have taken all those really good stories and just separated out all those stories which were not quite so good, and just, made my own collection of the really good stories, that would have been quite fun to read. And that, of course, is what people do, right? That's why you so seldom see the complete Brothers Grimm on the bookshelves. You more often will see selected stories, right? So I really wanted to read the whole thing just so I could say I've read the whole thing. I've got one of these tendencies to try and work my way through the classics. But it is a bit of a slog to read the whole thing. If you have a collection of selected stories, that could be quite good. The other reason perhaps why you don't see the whole thing on the bookshelves all that much is because there are a few stories in here that have not aged well. Where is it? There are two, arguably three stories that are anti-Semitic. I say arguably three because in the third story, the Jew is portrayed not as the villain, he's portrayed as the victim. So I've seen that listed on Wikipedia and stuff like that as a questionable story, but I guess I might be with the people who think, okay, that third story is all right. But there are definitely two stories. One is story number 8, right at the beginning, The Good Bargain, where there's a greedy Jew who's trying to cheat somebody out of his money. And then the other story, sorry, I'm trying to locate it here. It's in here somewhere. It's in here somewhere, but it's The Jew Among Thorns, which is the name of the story. And there's actually, if I can find it in here, Wordsworth publishers have put a small disclaimer on the front of that story, which is in here somewhere, but I'll just summarize it. The disclaimer is something to the effect of course, no modern reader is going to agree with this story, but we put it here just for the interest of preserving history, because this was part of the original collection. Yeah, I would agree with that. You know, as I think it is important to preserve the classics in their unedited form, even though we do have to realize that some of this stuff is not aged well. Where it gets maybe a little tricky again is deciding whether or not this is a book for scholars or a book for children. Because you don't want to give children a story with the Jew among thorns. So if you were to find this book in the children's section of your bookstore, it would probably be a selected edition of the Brothers Grimm. And of course that legacy of anti-Semitism does not bode well for the legacy of the Brothers Grimm, especially taken into consideration the fact that they were actively editing these stories and they were removing stories that they didn't think fit their vision of German nationalism. The fact that they left in the Jew among thorns, it says something. And somewhere on the internet, and again I've lost the link, but I was reading about how the Nazis quite like the Brothers Grimm, and how the stories like The Jew Among Thorns was quite popular in German schoolrooms in the 1930s. And they said you could hear the children laughing through the halls as the teacher was reading the story to them. And it is, I hate to say this, but it could be kind of a funny story if you overlook the terrible racism or anti-Semitic part of it. But I don't want to spend too much time talking about that, because even though that is interesting to consider, those are just two stories. And one of the things I'm trying to avoid doing in this review is trying to spend too much time talking about any one individual story, because there are like so many stories in here, and a lot of them provoked thoughts of one kind or another with me. Either this is a really well told story for this reason, or this is a really badly told story for this reason. I think I might leave the review off here, because I'm not sure how much more I have to say about this book in general without getting into specific stories. So yeah, I'll leave this off here. But by all means, let me know what you think about this book in the comments, or let me know if you have any insight into why the legends are classified differently than the stories, or any of those other questions around here. But yeah, I'm going to sign off here.